decades, the United States government ran a secret domestic operation with one goal: to neutralize what it saw as internal threats. But these so-called threats weren't spies or terrorists. They were civil rights leaders, organizers, community builders, black men and women demanding dignity, equality, and justice. The program was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Under the direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, it officially launched in 1956, targeting communists. But by the mid-1960s, COINTELPRO turned its full attention toward the Black Liberation Movement. The FBI did more than keep people under watch. They planted informants, spread lies, used intimidation, and were involved in actions that sometimes ended in violence. Yes, this actually happened. It was carried out, recorded, and had real consequences. The stories we'll cover in this video are not just about the FBI. They're about the black leaders whose lives were disrupted, and in some cases destroyed. Leaders who dared to challenge a country still gripped by white supremacy. Give this video a like to show your support. And let's begin with one of its earliest and most watched figures, a man whose belief in nonviolence made him a target anyway: Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arguably the most famous civil rights leader of the 20th century, and as it turned out, one of COINTELPRO's prime targets. By the late 1950s, Dr. King had risen to national prominence advocating nonviolent resistance to end segregation. He led the 1955-56 Montgomery bus boycott, and in 1957, co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to coordinate civil rights campaigns across the South. King's philosophy of nonviolence and his appeals to American ideals made him a widely respected figure, culminating in the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. But King's popularity and influence also alarmed J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. In the Bureau's eyes, the civil rights movement threatened the status quo, and they were eager to find grounds to undermine its leader. As early as the founding of the SCLC in 1957, the FBI began monitoring King and his associates, initially justifying the surveillance by alleging communist influence in the movement. One internal memo in October 1956 folded the FBI's ongoing surveillance of black leaders into the COINTELPRO program on the premise that the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communists. Key King associates like advisor Stanley Levison and organizer Bayard Rustin were flagged, and through them, King himself came under FBI scrutiny. Hoover's personal distrust of King soon grew into open animus. In August 1963, the March on Washington drew 250,000 supporters, and King's oratory captivated the nation, an event that Hoover saw as a tipping point. After that march, Hoover singled out King as a major target for COINTELPRO, instructing his deputies to intensify operations against the civil rights leader. FBI Assistant Director William C. Sullivan, who led the COINTELPRO section, wrote a notorious memo following King's speech. In the light of King's powerful demagogic speech, we must mark him now as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security, Sullivan warned. By Hoover's order, the Bureau was effectively treating Dr. King as an enemy of the state. The FBI's campaign against King was sweeping and relentless. Under Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's hesitant approval, the FBI installed wiretaps on King's phones starting in October 1963, ostensibly for a one-month trial. But in practice, it became a years-long invasive surveillance. Soon, the FBI was systematically bugging King's home and his hotel rooms, monitoring his private conversations around the clock. Teams of agents shadowed King during travel. They tapped the SCLC's office phones and those of King's colleagues. Importantly, this surveillance produced no evidence that King was involved in any unlawful or subversive activity. FBI reports acknowledged that King was not a communist himself. Nevertheless, Hoover was determined to neutralize King by any means necessary. The Bureau shifted to a strategy of personal sabotage. They hoped to destroy King's reputation and influence by exposing details of his private life. By the middle of 1964, FBI wiretaps had picked up evidence of King's extramarital relationships. Instead of ignoring these irrelevant personal matters, the Bureau saw an opportunity. In November 1964, just as King was about to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI took the extraordinary step of sending an anonymous package to King in an attempt to blackmail him. Inside the package was an audio reel of the FBI's secret recordings, supposedly capturing sexual encounters, along with an unsigned letter drafted to sound like it came from an angry civil rights supporter. This letter has since become infamous as the FBI King suicide letter. The letter explicitly attacked King, calling him a complete fraud and a liability, and claiming that black people would no longer tolerate such filthy, abnormal behavior. It concluded with a menacing ultimatum. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. The clear implication was that King should take his own life to avoid public exposure of the tapes. The timing was calculated. The package was sent just days after the announcement of King's Nobel Peace Prize, presumably to reach him before the awards ceremony. King understood the letter as an effort to drive him to do it. But King did not bow to this vile intimidation. He told associates, "A letter of this sort will not deter me." And he went on to accept the Nobel Prize in December 1964. Stymied by King's refusal to back down, the FBI escalated its dirty tricks. When King would not acquiesce, FBI Assistant Director Cartha D. DeLoach initiated a media leak campaign, offering the salacious surveillance transcripts to friendly journalists in early 1965. The FBI tried to plant stories accusing King of immoral conduct, hoping to splinter his support among faith leaders and donors. Around this same time, King had publicly criticized the FBI for its failure to protect black citizens from racial violence in the South, noting that the Bureau seemed ineffective against Ku Klux Klan terrorism. Hoover's response was to publicly call King the most notorious liar in the country in November 1964. This was an extraordinary public smear from the nation's top law enforcement official. Behind the scenes, Hoover kept pressing his agents to find any avenue to disgrace King. Internal FBI communications openly discussed using news outlets, ministers, sponsors of the NAACP, and others hostile to King to circulate derogatory information from the wiretaps. In essence, the FBI acted as a propaganda machine against King, supplying ammunition to his segregationist opponents to undermine his moral authority. Despite all these efforts, King's stature only grew as he led the historic Selma voting rights campaign in 1965 and spoke out against the Vietnam War by 1967. But the FBI never relented. Even after King's assassination on April 4, 1968, the Bureau continued trying to tarnish his legacy. A year after King's death, the FBI was still, in its own words, attempting to furnish ammunition to opponents of King to enable attacks on his memory and to block efforts to honor the slain leader. Hoover personally intervened behind the scenes to try to derail plans for a national holiday in King's honor, providing derogatory FBI files to Congress and state officials in 1969. The depth of the FBI's hostility was such that even death did not exempt Dr. King from COINTELPRO's grasp. It was only in the 1970s, when COINTELPRO was finally exposed, that the truth of this campaign came to light. The 1975-76 Church Committee investigation confirmed that the FBI's intent was not law enforcement at all, but to thwart King's leadership of the civil rights movement. One Church Committee report noted that the FBI had hoped to remove King from his pedestal and replace him with what Hoover considered older, more established conservative black leaders like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. In essence, the FBI wanted to choose Black America's leaders by eliminating those like King, whom Hoover saw as too progressive or too independent. The consequences of COINTELPRO's crusade against Martin Luther King Jr. were profound. In King's lifetime, the FBI's hounding undoubtedly caused him great stress and worry. Friends observed that he was keenly aware of being surveilled, and the anonymous threats weighed on him. The attempted blackmail in 1964 was described by historians as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the FBI. King persevered, but the FBI's constant pressure may have narrowed the space for him to build broader alliances. After King's assassination, the FBI's failure to protect civil rights workers came under scrutiny.